What you're about to hear should not be in this video. For decades, federal agencies worked tirelessly to ensure that this story would never leave the mountains. Documents were sealed under classifications that were never meant to expire. Witnesses were silenced through methods that ranged from intimidation to complete disappearance. Entire families vanished from census records as if they had never drawn breath on American soil. The hollows of Appalachia have always kept their secrets buried, deep beneath layers of fog and forest and generational silence. But this particular secret was buried so deep that even the land itself seemed to forget what had happened there. What occurred in Blackwood Hollow between 1951 and 1967 was not an accident of circumstance. It was not a natural disaster that swept through and claimed lives indiscriminately. It was not an outbreak that medicine could not contain. It was a calculated decision made by men in government offices hundreds of miles away, men who never set foot in those mountains, men who never looked into the eyes of the people they condemned, men who signed papers and authorized protocols that would destroy an entire community through slow, invisible, methodical destruction. The people of Blackwood Hollow trusted their country with the simple faith of those who had never been given reason to doubt. They believed in the promise of progress, in the benevolence of institutions, in the fundamental decency of a nation they had served and sacrificed for across generations. And that trust, that innocent and unquestioning trust, was weaponized against them in ways that would only come to light half a century later. Through leaked files that were never meant to see daylight, through documents that slipped through the cracks of a system designed to protect its own crimes. What you are about to hear will fundamentally change the way you understand the relationship between rural America and the institutions that claimed to protect it. This is not conspiracy theory. This is not speculation built on rumor and fear. This is documented history, verified through official records that the government itself created and then desperately tried to destroy. Stay until the very end of this video, because the final revelation, the truth they fought hardest to bury, will not come until the closing moments. By the time this story concludes, you will understand why certain truths are buried beneath mountains of classification, why certain names were erased from every record that could be reached, and why the people of Blackwood Hollow paid a price that no community, no family, no human being should ever have to pay for the sins of those who claimed to serve them. The Appalachian Mountains in the early 1950s existed as a world entirely apart from the rest of America. While cities expanded outward in rings of suburban development and highways stretched across the nation like arteries of progress, the hollows remained, locked in a different century, accessible only by dirt roads that washed away with every heavy rain and became impassable rivers of mud during the wet seasons. Blackwood Hollow sat in the deepest fold of the eastern Kentucky mountains, a community of roughly 400 souls who had lived on that land for generations, stretching back beyond living memory. They were miners who descended into the earth each morning and emerged each evening coated in black dust that would eventually fill their lungs and steal their breath. They were farmers who coaxed crops from soil that was never meant for agriculture, fighting the steep grades and rocky ground for every ear of corn, every head of cabbage, every potato that would see their families through another winter. They were moonshiners who knew the hidden places where stills could bubble away undetected, producing the clear liquor that supplemented meager incomes and provided the only medicine many families could afford. They married within the valley because there was no one else to marry. They buried their dead on the hillsides overlooking the homes where those dead had lived their entire lives. They passed down stories that stretched back to before the Civil War, tales of ancestors who had carved this existence from wilderness and defended it against all comers. The outside world rarely entered Blackwood Hollow, and those who lived there rarely left. It was a place of profound isolation that bred both hardship and resilience in equal measure. The people of Blackwood Hollow had survived poverty that would have broken communities with greater resources. They had survived epidemics that swept through the mountains and took the young and the old with equal cruelty. They had survived the collapse of the timber industry that had once provided steady wages, adapting and persevering as they always had. They had learned to endure whatever the world threw at them, bending but never breaking, holding on to their land and their families and their way of life with a tenacity that defined their very identity. But nothing in their history, nothing in their collective experience of hardship and survival had prepared them for what was coming down that mountain road in the autumn of 1951. The convoy appeared on a Tuesday morning in late October, when the leaves had turned to fire on the hillsides and the air carried the first sharp bite of approaching winter. 12 vehicles in total, more automobiles than most residents of the Hollow had ever seen in one place, winding slowly up the rutted track that served as the community's only connection to the outside world. The trucks carried men in suits whose fabric was too fine for these mountains, men in white lab coats that seemed to glow against the autumn colors, equipment wrapped in tarps and secured with ropes, and crates marked with numbers and federal seals that no one in the Hollow could identify. The residents watched from their porches, emerging from cabins and worksheds, gathering in small clusters to observe this unprecedented intrusion. Children were called back from play and held close. Men set down their tools and stood with arms crossed, faces unreadable. Women paused in their work, hands still wet from washing or dusted with flour, watching with uncertainty and curiosity mingled in their expressions. They had never seen so many outsiders at once. They had never seen vehicles so clean, so polished, so obviously expensive. Something significant was happening, but no one could yet imagine what. The leader of the convoy was a man named Dr. Harold Whitmore, a federal researcher whose name would later be redacted from every official record with such thoroughness that it would take decades of investigation to recover it. Dr. Whitmore was 53 years old, grey at the temples, with wire-rimmed spectacles, and a manner that projected authority and trustworthiness in equal measure. He had been selected for this assignment precisely because of his ability to inspire confidence in populations that had every reason to distrust outsiders. He had done this work before, in other isolated communities, though the residents of Blackwood Hollow would never learn this. He gathered the community in the small wooden church that served as their meeting hall, the only structure in the Hollow large enough to hold a significant portion of the population. The pews creaked as families settled in, pressing close together, the smell of wood smoke and earth and honest labor filling the space. Dr. Whitmore stood at the front, flanked by 2 associates whose names were never recorded, and made an announcement that would change the trajectory of every life in that room. The government, he explained in a voice that was warm and measured and carefully modulated to inspire trust, had selected Blackwood Hollow for a special program. A health initiative designed specifically for communities like theirs, communities that had been overlooked and underserved for too long. The residents would receive free medical care of a quality that would otherwise be completely inaccessible to them. They would receive vaccinations against diseases that had long plagued the mountains, diseases that had taken children and elders and workers in their prime. They would have access to experimental treatments that represented the cutting edge of medical science, treatments that would protect them and strengthen them and give them advantages that wealthy city dwellers paid fortunes to receive. In return, they were asked only to cooperate with the medical personnel who would be stationed in the hollow. They were asked to allow periodic examinations, to provide samples when requested, to follow the protocols that the doctors established. They were asked, most of all, to trust in the process, to believe that the government had their best interests at heart and was finally extending to them the benefits of American progress. The people of Blackwood Hollow had no reason to distrust the government that stood before them in the form of this kindly, authoritative doctor. They had sent their sons to fight in 2 world wars, had watched young men march down that mountain road to defend a nation they had never seen beyond their own hills. They paid their taxes, limited as those payments were given their poverty. They flew the American flag on holidays and taught their children to pledge allegiance to the republic for which it stood. And they desperately, urgently, painfully needed medical care. The nearest hospital was over 60 miles away, across roads that were often completely impassable, staffed by doctors who charged fees that a year of mining wages could not cover. Children died of ailments that could have been treated. Women perished in childbirth for want of basic intervention. Men coughed out their lungs from the coal dust and had no recourse but to keep working until they could not rise from their beds. Dr. Whitmore's offer seemed like a blessing sent from a God they had prayed to for generations. They agreed without hesitation, signing forms they could barely read, trusting in the promise that had been made to them. The program began quietly in the weeks that followed. Medical tents were erected near the church, white canvas structures that seemed impossibly clean against the weathered wood and packed earth of the hollow. Nurses arrived, young women in crisp uniforms who smiled and spoke gently and seemed genuinely interested in the welfare of their patients. More equipment arrived, machines that hummed and clicked, devices that measured and recorded, instruments that gleamed with sterile precision. The residents lined up for examinations, submitting to procedures they did not understand, answering questions about their health and their family histories and their daily habits. They gave samples, blood drawn into glass vials, urine collected in sterile containers, hair and nail clippings gathered and labeled. They received injections, needles sliding into arms and delivering substances that the doctors assured them were vitamins and vaccines and protective compounds. Children were given special attention, their small bodies measured and weighed and examined with particular thoroughness. Pregnant women were monitored closely, their conditions tracked through every stage of development. For the first few months, everything seemed to be working exactly as promised. The community felt cared for in ways they had never experienced, attended to by professionals who seemed to regard their health as genuinely important. Dr. Whitmore became a familiar presence, walking through the hollow at all hours, speaking with families in their homes, asking about their lives and their histories and their struggles. He seemed genuinely interested, genuinely concerned, genuinely committed to their welfare. He remembered names and birthdays and family connections. He attended funerals and visited the sick and played with children who had never seen a doctor before. He became, in the eyes of many, a savior sent to lift them from the neglect they had always endured. But beneath the surface of care and concern, something else entirely was happening. The injections were not vitamins, the examinations were not routine health assessments, the samples were not being analyzed to improve treatment protocols, and the documents being filed in offices in Washington, documents that no resident of Blackwood Hollow would ever see, described their community not as a population receiving aid, but as a test cohort for a classified research initiative with objectives that had nothing to do with their welfare. The people of Blackwood Hollow had become subjects in an experiment they had never consented to join, their bodies and their lives converted into data points in studies that would advance agendas they could not imagine. The trust they had offered so freely had been accepted and exploited, their vulnerability transformed into opportunity by men who saw them not as human beings deserving of protection, but as resources to be utilized in pursuit of goals that would never be shared with them. The program had begun, and there was no mechanism by which it could be stopped, no authority to which they could appeal, no escape from the fate that had been decided for them in offices they would never enter, by men they would never meet, for reasons they would never understand. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. What you are about to hear in the coming chapters reveals why certain experiments were conducted far from public oversight, in places where the victims had no voice and no power to resist. Subscribe now, because these truths deserve witnesses, and the people of Blackwood Hollow deserve to have their story heard by those who will remember. By 1953, the first undeniable signs of trouble began to emerge in Blackwood Hollow, manifesting initially among the most vulnerable members of the community. It started with the children, those who had been healthy and active before the program began, running through the hollow, climbing trees, helping with chores, living the vigorous lives that mountain children had always lived. Several of these children now suffered from unexplained fatigue that kept them bedridden for days at a time. They complained of muscle weakness that made simple tasks exhausting. They developed recurring fevers that would spike and break and spike again without pattern or apparent cause. Their appetites diminished, their growth slowed, and a pallor crept into complexions that had once been ruddy with health. The parents brought their concerns to Dr. Whitmore, gathering in the medical tent with their listless children, describing symptoms and seeking answers. Dr. Whitmore listened with apparent concern, examined the children thoroughly, consulted his notes and his colleagues, and then offered reassurance that these were normal side effects of the treatments being administered. The injections were powerful, he explained, designed to strengthen the immune system and protect against serious diseases. Such strength came at a temporary cost. The body needed time to adjust, to integrate the protective compounds, to build the immunity that would serve these children for the rest of their lives. He prescribed rest and additional injections to support the adjustment process. The parents, trusting his expertise, trusting the authority he represented, trusting the care he had shown them, complied with his instructions. They kept their children home from play. They administered the supplements he provided. They brought them back for additional injections. And they watched, with growing unease they could not yet articulate, as the symptoms did not improve but worsened, as the children they had brought into the world faded before their eyes. By the end of 1953, 3 children had died. The first was Thomas Garrett, 7 years old, who had been among the healthiest boys in the hollow before the program began. He died in November, after 6 weeks of progressive decline, his small body simply giving out despite every intervention the doctors attempted. The second was Mary Ellen Cooper, 5 years old, who followed Thomas into death just 12 days later, her symptoms nearly identical to his. The third was an infant, James Robert Sloan, only 14 months old, who had been born healthy and remained so, until he received his first series of injections at 6 months of age. He died 3 days before Christmas, in the arms of a mother who would never fully recover from the loss. The causes listed on their death certificates were vague and clinical: respiratory failure, cardiac complications, general systemic decline. No autopsies were performed despite the unusual clustering of deaths. The bodies were buried quickly, interred in the hillside cemetery where generations of the Hollow's children already rested. Dr. Whitmore personally attended each funeral, standing with bowed head as prayers were spoken over small graves, offering condolences and comfort to families shattered by loss. He spoke of God's mysterious purposes, of the fragility of young life, of the importance of faith in times of sorrow. He seemed genuinely moved, genuinely grieved, genuinely affected by the tragedies that had struck the community he had come to serve. The community mourned, as it had always mourned, with the stoic grief of people who had buried too many children over too many generations. Death was not uncommon in the Hollow. It never had been. Children had always been vulnerable to illness in these mountains, where medical care was scarce and conditions were harsh. 3 deaths in 2 months was unusual, certainly, but not unprecedented. The program continued without interruption, and the parents who had lost children continued to bring their surviving children for treatment. Because what else could they do? The doctors were their only hope. The program was their only access to care. And they had been assured repeatedly and convincingly that these deaths were tragedies of nature, not consequences of intervention. They believed because they needed to believe. They trusted because the alternative was unthinkable. In 1954, the focus of the program expanded significantly to include the adult population, with particular attention to the miners who formed the economic backbone of the community. These men had worked the coal seams for decades, descending into darkness each morning and emerging each evening with the black dust of the earth coating their skin and filling their lungs. Many already suffered from the respiratory ailments that were the inevitable consequence of their labor, the coughing and wheezing and shortness of breath that marked every miner who survived long enough to develop them. They were brought to the medical tent in groups, examined with the same thoroughness that had been applied to the children, and then offered a new treatment protocol. These specialized injections, Dr. Whitmore explained, had been developed specifically for workers like them, men whose lungs were under constant assault from the particulates of their profession. The compounds would protect their respiratory systems, would slow or halt the progression of the damage, would give them years of healthy labor that the disease would otherwise steal from them. The miners, many of whom already coughed constantly and struggled to breathe after even mild exertion, welcomed any help that was offered. They had watched fathers and uncles and brothers die gasping for air, had seen strong men reduced to invalids by the dust that was the price of their livelihood. If the government had finally developed something that could protect them, they would be fools to refuse it. They received their injections with gratitude, rolled down their sleeves, and returned to the mines. Within months, their conditions accelerated in ways that defied every assurance they had been given. Men who had been able to work full shifts, who had maintained their strength despite their symptoms, now collapsed after a few hours underground. They emerged from the mines grey-faced and gasping, leaning on younger workers, barely able to climb the ladders that led back to daylight. Their skin took on a greyish pallor that went beyond coal dust, a sickly undertone that spoke of something wrong. Deep inside, their eyes yellowed, the whites taking on a jaundiced tint that their wives noticed first and commented on with growing alarm. Their coughs deepened, producing matter that was no longer merely black, but streaked with other colors, other substances, other evidence of deterioration. The company doctors, when consulted, blamed the coal dust and recommended early retirement for the worst cases. But retirement meant no income in a community where there was no other work. It meant no support from a company that had no obligation to workers who could no longer produce. It meant no future for families that depended on wages that would no longer come. The miners continued working until they physically could not continue, until their bodies simply refused to carry them through another shift. Some died in the tunnels, collapsing in the darkness, their last breaths drawn in the place that had killed them. Others died in their beds, surrounded by families who watched helplessly as the men who had supported them faded away. The death toll among adult males in the Hollow climbed steadily through 1954 and into 1955, each funeral adding to a grief that was becoming unbearable, each grave raising questions that no one dared to ask aloud. The women of Blackwood Hollow began to notice patterns that the men, focused on survival and labor, had been unable to see. They gathered in kitchens over coffee and biscuits, on porches in the evening cool, in the quiet moments after church. When the men went to smoke and talk of other things, they compared notes in hushed voices, afraid to speak too loudly, afraid to name the fear that was growing in all of them. The children who had died, they realized, had all received the same series of injections in the weeks before their symptoms began. The miners who had deteriorated fastest had all participated in the specialized treatment program that had been introduced with such fanfare. And there were other things, smaller, but no less disturbing. Samples of well water had been taken from multiple locations throughout the hollow, collected in sterile containers by medical personnel who offered no explanation and never returned with results. Soil from certain fields had been gathered and carted away, the earth itself apparently of interest to these outsiders who claimed to care only about human health. Strange markings had been painted on trees near the hollow's entrance, symbols that no one recognized, patterns that seemed to serve some purpose that was never explained. Equipment had been installed at various points throughout the community, devices that hummed quietly and seemed to measure something that remained unidentified. The women began to ask questions, approaching the nurses first, then the doctors, then Dr. Whitmore himself. The answers they received were evasive, dismissive, designed to reassure without actually providing information. Dr. Whitmore smiled his kind smile and spoke in his gentle voice and insisted that everything was proceeding as planned, that the program was achieving its objectives, that the community would soon see the benefits that had been promised. The nurses changed the subject with practiced ease, redirecting conversations toward mundane matters, deflecting inquiry with cheerful competence. And the men in suits who occasionally arrived with the supply convoys spoke to no one at all, simply observing and taking notes in leather-bound journals before disappearing back down the mountain road. The questions remained unanswered, and the pattern of death and decline continued without interruption. By 1956, the death toll in Blackwood Hollow had risen to a level that could no longer be ignored or attributed to the ordinary hardships of mountain life. 17 residents had died in 5 years, a staggering number for a community of 400, a rate of mortality that exceeded anything in the Hollow's recorded history. The survivors were weakened by ailments that had no name and no cure. They were frightened by losses that seemed to strike without pattern or mercy, and they were increasingly suspicious of the program that had arrived with such promises and delivered only grief. A delegation of elders, the oldest and most respected men in the community, approached Dr. Whitmore with a list of demands that had been debated and refined over weeks of secret meetings. They wanted to see the records of the treatments that had been administered. They wanted to know exactly what substances had been injected into their bodies and the bodies of their children. They wanted documentation of the program's objectives and methods. They wanted the truth, plainly stated, without evasion or deflection. They had trusted the government with their lives, and now they demanded an accounting of how that trust had been used. Dr. Whitmore's demeanor changed that day in ways that none of the elders would ever forget. The warmth that had characterized his presence for 5 years disappeared, as if it had never existed. The gentle voice hardened into something cold and bureaucratic. The kindly eyes behind the wire-rimmed spectacles became flat and assessing, calculating rather than caring. He informed the elders in terms that were precise and measured and utterly devoid of compassion, that the program was a federal initiative operating under authorities that superseded any local concerns. All records were classified under national security provisions that prohibited their release to unauthorized persons. Any attempt to interfere with program operations would be met with consequences that he declined to specify, but implied would be severe. He reminded them, with a cruelty that was all the more devastating for its professional detachment, that they had signed consent forms when the program began, documents that most of them could barely read, documents that had been presented as simple formalities acknowledging their participation. Those forms, he explained, gave the federal government full authority over their medical care and exempted the program from any obligation to disclose its methods or objectives. The elders had no legal standing to demand anything. They had no power to compel any disclosure. They had no recourse to any authority that would hear their complaints. They could cooperate, or they could face the consequences of non-cooperation. The choice, such as it was, remained theirs. The elders returned to their families in silence, carrying a weight of understanding that they could not articulate to those who had not been in that room. The program they had welcomed as salvation had become something else entirely, something that held their community in a grip they could not break. They had no power to resist, no means of escape, no hope of rescue from forces they did not understand. They could only endure, as generations of their ancestors had endured before them, and pray that endurance would be enough. The following year brought an expansion of the program that made its true nature increasingly difficult to ignore. New personnel arrived with the spring thaw, younger researchers who lacked even the pretense of warmth that Dr. Whitmore had initially projected. Additional equipment arrived in quantities that suggested operations far beyond simple health monitoring, machines and devices and containers that were unloaded and transported to destinations within the Hollow that were increasingly restricted. A site on the eastern edge of the community, a clearing that had once been used for community gatherings and autumn festivals, was fenced off and marked as federal property. The fencing was tall and solid, blocking any view of what was being constructed within. Signs warned against trespassing, against photography, against any approach within 50 meters of the perimeter. Armed guards appeared, men in uniforms that bore no insignia, who patrolled the fence line day and night and answered no questions from the residents who watched them from a distance. At night, strange lights flickered behind the fences, illumination that shifted and changed in patterns that suggested activity rather than mere security. Sounds emerged that no one in the Hollow could identify, mechanical hums that rose and fell, occasional alarms that shrieked and then cut off abruptly, and once, late on a summer night, a scream that was human and anguished and terrified, silenced so quickly that those who heard it wondered afterward if they had imagined it. The children who lived nearest to the fenced site began having nightmares, dreams of things they could not describe when they woke crying in the darkness. Some refused to sleep at all, fighting exhaustion until their small bodies surrendered against their will. Parents tried to comfort them, to explain away the fears, to promise safety that the parents themselves no longer believed in. But how could they explain what they themselves did? Not understand. The Hollow had become a prison without walls, its boundaries enforced not by fences, but by isolation and powerlessness, and the absolute authority of forces against which resistance was impossible. If this story is affecting you, take a moment to leave a comment with this thought. How many communities were sacrificed for the progress that never reached them, for experiments they never agreed to, for knowledge that benefited only those who already had everything? In the autumn of 1958, a young woman named Clara Boggs made a decision that would ultimately change the trajectory of this entire hidden history. Clara was 23 years old, the daughter of a miner named William Boggs, who had died the previous spring after participating in the specialized treatment program for coal workers. She was also the mother of a 2-year-old son named Daniel, who had been born sickly and remained fragile, despite the treatments that had been administered since his birth. Clara had participated in the program from its inception, had received injections and examinations and monitoring along with everyone else in the Hollow. She had watched her father deteriorate with terrifying speed after receiving the treatments that were supposed to protect his lungs. She had held his hand as he died, had listened to his final breaths rattle in a chest that had once been strong enough to swing a pickaxe for 12 hours straight. She had buried him on the hillside next to his father, and grandfather had stood at his grave and made a silent vow that his death would not be meaningless. She no longer trusted Dr. Whitmore or any of the medical personnel who had become fixtures in the Hollow. She no longer trusted the program that had promised so much and delivered only grief. She no longer trusted anyone or anything that came from outside these mountains. And she had begun, quietly and secretly, to keep records of her own. Clara could read and write with a facility that was unusual. In the Hollow, a skill she had developed during 2 years at a school in the nearest town, where an aunt had taken her in after her mother's death when Clara was 14. She had returned to the Hollow at 16 to care for her aging grandmother. But she had retained the literacy that those years had given her, and she had cultivated it in the years since through voracious reading of whatever books and newspapers found their way into the community. She used this skill now for a purpose she had never anticipated, creating a hidden archive of everything she could document about the program and its effects. She recorded the names of those who had died, noting their ages, their family connections, their symptoms, and the treatments they had received. She documented the dates of significant events, the arrivals of new personnel, the expansion of the fenced facility, the patterns she and other women had identified in whispered conversations. She wrote down lies that had been told and promises that had been broken. She preserved testimonies from those willing to share their experiences, transcribing their words as accurately as she could manage. She hid her notes in a tin box beneath the floorboards of her cabin, adding to them whenever new information emerged, building an archive that grew steadily as the months passed. She did not know what she would do with this evidence, did not know if it would ever matter, did not know if anyone outside the Hollow would ever care what had happened here. But she knew that it needed to exist. Someone, someday, would need to know the truth. And if no one else would preserve it, then she would bear that responsibility alone. Clara's opportunity to share what she had documented came in the spring of 1959, through an arrival that no one in the Hollow had anticipated. A journalist named Thomas Mercer appeared in the region, driving a battered sedan along roads that were barely passable, asking questions in towns and villages throughout the mountains. Mercer worked for a small newspaper in Lexington, a publication with more ambition than resources, which had given him latitude to pursue stories that larger outlets ignored. He had heard rumors about strange happenings in the mountain hollows, whispers of government activity, unusual deaths, communities that had gone silent and fearful. These rumors had reached him through channels he never fully explained, fragments of information that had somehow escaped the isolation that was supposed to contain them. He was investigating, following threads that might lead nowhere, hoping to find something that would justify the weeks he had spent on mountain roads, far from anything resembling civilization. When he reached the outskirts of Blackwood Hollow, he was stopped by guards who emerged from the roadside with weapons displayed and authority assumed. He was informed that the area beyond was restricted, that he had no authorization to proceed, that he should turn around and return the way he had come. He asked questions and received no answers. He showed his press credentials and was told they meant nothing here. He was escorted back down the road by men who watched until he was out of sight. But Thomas Mercer was not the kind of journalist who accepted dismissal easily. He parked his car on a logging road several miles from the Hollow and set out on foot, hiking through forest that had never been logged and terrain that fought every step he took. It took him most of a day to circle around the approaches that were guarded and find a route into the hollow from the north, where the mountains rose too steeply for regular patrol. He emerged from the tree line exhausted, scratched, and thoroughly lost, with no clear idea where in the community he had arrived or how he would find anyone willing to talk to him. Clara Boggs found him at the edge of her property, sitting on a fallen log and trying to catch his breath, his city shoes ruined and his suit coat torn in 3 places. She approached him cautiously, this stranger who had appeared from the forest like something out of a story, and asked him who he was and what he wanted. His answer, delivered between gasps for air, was unlike anything she had expected. He told her he was looking for the truth. She studied him for a long moment, evaluating, calculating, deciding. Then she brought him inside, fed him what food she had, and listened to his questions. And then, for the first time, since she had begun her documentation, she showed someone outside her small circle of trust what she had gathered. She retrieved the tin box from beneath her floorboards and placed it on the table between them, watching his face as he began to understand what he was seeing. Thomas Mercer spent 3 days in Blackwood Hollow, hidden in Clara's cabin during daylight hours to avoid detection, conducting interviews with residents who were willing to speak to him after Clara vouched for his intentions. What he learned over those 3 days horrified him in ways that nothing in his journalistic career had prepared him for. The program, he concluded from the evidence before him, was not a health initiative in any meaningful sense. It was an experiment, a systematic study using human subjects who had never been informed of the true nature of their participation. The residents of Blackwood Hollow had been used to test the effects of various compounds, substances that Mercer's limited scientific knowledge could not fully identify, but that the documents suggested included radioactive isotopes and chemical agents with unknown properties. The injections, the water samples, the soil collections, the fenced facility on the edge of the hollow, all of it pointed to a coordinated research effort that treated human beings as laboratory animals, as resources to be used and expended in pursuit of data. The children who had died, the miners who had deteriorated, the unexplained illnesses that continued to spread through the community. These were not accidents or misfortunes. They were results, outcomes that had been anticipated and recorded, data points in studies that would inform future applications the residents could not imagine. Mercer filled notebook after notebook with what he learned. He copied sections of Clara's documentation, creating a duplicate archive that he concealed in his clothing. He photographed what he could with a small camera he had brought. He gathered evidence with the systematic thoroughness of a man who understood that what he held could change everything, could expose crimes that had been hidden behind the walls of classification and the isolation of geography. Thomas Mercer returned to Lexington at the end of March 1959 and immediately sought a meeting with his editor to discuss what he had found. The meeting did not go as he expected. His editor, a man named Harold Patterson, who had always supported Mercer's investigative work, listened to the initial summary of his findings with an expression that shifted from interest to concern to something that looked very much like fear. Patterson stopped Mercer before he could finish, closed the office door, and spoke in a voice that was lower than Mercer had ever heard him use. The story was too explosive, the accusations were too serious, the targets were too powerful. Publication would bring federal attention of a kind that a small newspaper could not survive. There would be investigations, subpoenas, pressure applied through channels that Patterson did not specify, but clearly understood. The paper would be destroyed, and the people who worked for it would be destroyed along with it. Mercer protested, argued, pleaded. He had evidence, he had documentation, he had witnesses who could corroborate everything. Patterson shook his head and repeated his refusal. The story could not be published. The evidence should be destroyed. And Mercer should forget that he had ever heard of Blackwood Hollow if he valued his career and his safety. Mercer left that meeting with his notes and photographs still in his possession, his determination undiminished, but his path forward suddenly unclear. If his own newspaper would not publish the story, he would find someone who would. He reached out to larger newspapers, to wire services, to congressional offices, to anyone with the power to bring this hidden atrocity into the light. His calls were not returned. His letters went unanswered. Doors that should have opened remained firmly closed, and in the summer of 1959, Thomas Mercer disappeared. His car was found abandoned on a mountain road 60 miles from Blackwood Hollow, the driver's door hanging open, the keys still in the ignition. His notebooks, his photographs, his copies of Clara's documentation were gone, removed so thoroughly that not a single page remained. His body was never found despite searches that extended for weeks through the surrounding wilderness. The official conclusion was that he had gotten lost in unfamiliar terrain and succumbed to exposure, his remains scattered by animals or claimed by one of the countless sinkholes that pocketed these mountains. His disappearance was reported in small notices in regional newspapers, a brief obituary for a journalist whose final story would never be told. In Blackwood Hollow, word of his fate reached Clara Boggs through channels she had cultivated over years of careful relationship building. She received the news in silence, her face betraying nothing of the grief and fear that churned within her. She knew that Mercer's death was not an accident, knew it with a certainty that required no proof. She knew that her own documentation made her a target, that her role in helping him could have been discovered, that the knock on her door could come at any moment. And she knew, with a resolve that had hardened into something unbreakable, that she could not stop. The truth existed. She held it in her hands, and as long as she lived, she would protect it until the day came when it could finally be told. The years that followed were the darkest in Blackwood Hollow's long and difficult history. The program continued, though its nature shifted and evolved in ways the residents could observe but not understand. The injections became less frequent, tapering off for many families, but the monitoring increased dramatically. Medical personnel visited monthly, conducting examinations that seemed designed not to treat illness, but to track its progression, to document the deterioration of bodies that had been damaged by interventions disguised as care. Residents who had developed chronic conditions after receiving treatments were studied intensively, subjected to tests and measurements and observations that served purposes never explained to them. Those who died were examined before burial with a thoroughness that bordered on desecration, tissue samples taken for analysis, organs removed and preserved, bodies treated not as vessels deserving respect, but as sources of data to be harvested. The community was no longer a test population in the active sense. It was a harvest, a resource being systematically collected as the long-term effects of the experimental program manifested in illness and death. And there was nothing the residents could do to stop it or escape it. The outside world had no idea what was happening in these mountains, no awareness that an American community was being used and destroyed by agencies sworn to protect it. The roads remained impassable for much of the year, washed out by spring rains, blocked by winter snows, maintained just well enough to allow government vehicles through, but not well enough to permit easy departure. Communication was limited to a single telephone at the general store, and residents had long since learned that their calls were monitored, their conversations recorded, their words analyzed for any sign of disloyalty or disclosure. Mail was intercepted and reviewed before delivery, letters opened and resealed with a carelessness that made the surveillance obvious and intimidating. Any attempt to leave the hollow permanently was met with obstacles that seemed insurmountable. documentation that failed to process, transportation that became unavailable, family members whose health suddenly required attention. The residents of Blackwood Hollow had become prisoners in their own home, confined not by walls, but by isolation and surveillance, and the absolute power of forces they could not fight. They were subjects in an experiment they had never agreed to join, and they would remain subjects until the experiment's designers decided they had nothing more to offer. Clara Boggs continued her documentation through these years, adding to her hidden archive with every new death, every new symptom, every new outrage she witnessed or learned of. She recruited a small network of trusted allies, women, mostly, who helped her gather information and keep watch for threats. They met in kitchens and root cellars, passing notes written in codes they developed together, preserving testimonies from those who would speak, recording observations that might someday prove what had been done to them. They called themselves the Witnesses, though they never spoke the name aloud, never acknowledged their network's existence to anyone outside it. Their mission was simple and terrifying: survive, record, and wait for an opportunity that might never come. The years passed with agonizing slowness. The 1950s gave way to the 1960s, and still the program continued. Dr. Whitmore was eventually replaced by a younger researcher, a man named Dr. Ellis Crane, who was even more cold and clinical than his predecessor, who showed no pretense of caring for the community he studied and exploited. The fenced facility on the edge of the hollow expanded, new structures erected behind barriers that grew ever higher, its purpose still unknown, but its presence a constant reminder of the power that held the hollow in its grip. By 1965, the death toll from the program had exceeded 50 souls. More than 10% of the Hollow's original population had perished from causes that were never fully explained, never honestly attributed to the treatments that had preceded them. The survivors bore the marks of their ordeal in ways both visible and hidden. Chronic illnesses plagued those who had been healthy before. The program began. Premature aging claimed people in their 40s and 50s, their bodies worn down by damage that accumulated year after year. Psychological trauma manifested in nightmares that returned nightly, in paranoia that made every stranger a threat, in despair so deep and pervasive that it colored every aspect of daily life. The children who had been born during the program years showed developmental delays and health problems that set them apart from previous generations, their bodies marked from conception by the substances their mothers had carried. The land itself seemed to have absorbed the contamination that had been inflicted on its people. Crops grew poorly in fields that had once been productive, yields declining year after year, despite every effort to maintain them. Livestock sickened from ailments that veterinarians could not diagnose. The water had a metallic taste that never went away, a subtle wrongness that residents learned to ignore because they had no alternative source. Blackwood Hollow was dying, slowly and systematically and comprehensively, and the people who lived there had no power to save themselves or their community from the destruction that had been imposed upon them. The turning point came in the spring of 1967, through an act of nature that no one could have predicted or controlled. A severe storm system struck the Appalachian Mountains in late March, bringing torrential rains that lasted for 5 days without interruption. The creeks that fed through the hollow became raging torrents. The roads washed out completely, cutting off even government access. Mudslides buried structures and blocked paths that had been used for generations. The power that fed the fenced facility failed, and backup systems were overwhelmed by damage that accumulated faster than it could be repaired. The guards who normally patrolled the perimeter were scattered by the chaos, forced to focus on immediate survival rather than security protocols. The fence itself was breached in multiple places, sections torn away by falling trees and surging water. A group of young men from the Hollow, emboldened by the chaos and desperate for answers that had been denied them all their lives, slipped through one of the breaches on the third night of the storm. They were the sons of men who had died, the brothers of children who had sickened, the heirs to a community that had been systematically destroyed. They moved through the compound in darkness, using lightning flashes to navigate, searching for anything that would explain what had been done to their families. What they found inside the facility would haunt them for the rest of their lives. There were laboratories filled with equipment they could not identify, machines and instruments that seemed designed for purposes beyond their comprehension. There were storage rooms containing containers labeled with codes and warnings, substances held in conditions that suggested extreme danger. There were medical spaces that looked less like clinics than like surgical theaters, tables with restraints, tools arranged with clinical precision. And there were records, filing cabinets filled with documents that detailed, in cold clinical language, the true nature of the program that had operated in their community for 16 years. The young men could not understand everything they saw in those hurried moments, reading by flashlight with rain pounding the roof above them. But they understood enough. They grabbed what they could carry, stuffing folders into their coats, filling bags with papers that seemed significant, taking everything they could manage before fleeing back through the breached fence and into the storm. They delivered their haul to Clara Boggs that same night, the papers sodden but legible, the truth finally in hands that would know what to do with it. The documents they had retrieved were damning beyond anything Clara had imagined in her worst fears. They described Blackwood Hollow as a designated testing site for experimental compounds developed under classified military programs. The residents had been selected specifically because of their isolation, their lack of political influence, their poverty, and their expendability. The substances administered to them included radioactive isotopes being studied for potential military applications, compounds designed to simulate the effects of nuclear exposure on civilian populations. The program's goals were stated with a clarity that was almost unbearable to read: to measure the long-term effects of controlled exposure on a stable, isolated population, to refine dosage protocols for compounds that might be deployed in various military and civilian contexts, to develop baseline data on human tolerance for substances that could not be ethically tested through any other means. The people of the Hollow were not patients receiving care. They were not beneficiaries of government health initiatives. They were research subjects, selected to suffer and die so that others might benefit from the knowledge gained through their destruction. Every death had been anticipated, every illness had been expected, every symptom had been recorded and analyzed and filed away in reports that would inform future applications. The program had succeeded beyond its designers' expectations, and it was scheduled to continue for another decade, until the population had been fully observed through multiple generations of exposure. Clara Boggs read these documents by candlelight in her cabin while the storm raged outside, her hands trembling with a mixture of vindication and horror. Everything she had suspected was confirmed, and the reality was worse than her darkest imaginings. The program had been authorized at the highest levels of the federal government. The deaths were not side effects to be minimized, but expected outcomes accounted for in the research design. And the program had been protected by classifications and security measures designed to ensure that no disclosure would ever be possible, that no accountability would ever be demanded, that the people of Blackwood Hollow would live and suffer and die without the outside world ever knowing what had been done to them. Clara understood that this information could change everything, could bring the justice that had been denied for so long, could expose the criminals who had destroyed her community. But reaching the Outside world had never been more dangerous. Mercer had tried and had paid with his life. Anyone who attempted to carry this evidence beyond the Hollow would face the same fate or worse. The documents needed to travel through hands that could be trusted absolutely, through channels that could not be monitored, to destinations that had the power to act on what they revealed. It would require planning and patience and an extraordinary amount of luck. Clara began to organize immediately. In the weeks that followed, as the Hollow recovered from the storm and the program resumed its operations with guards now doubled and surveillance intensified, Clara and her network developed a plan to smuggle the documents out of the Hollow. The papers would travel in portions, carried by individuals whose departures could be explained by ordinary circumstances, passed through a chain of contacts that Clara had cultivated over years of careful preparation. The ultimate destination was a journalist in Washington named Margaret Holloway, who had built a reputation for exposing government misconduct and who had the institutional support to withstand the pressure that disclosure would bring. The operation required patience measured in months rather than weeks. The first courier, a young woman named Jessie Harper, carried a portion of the documents hidden in the lining of her coat as she traveled to a relative's home in a neighboring county for what was ostensibly a family visit. She was stopped and questioned at a roadblock on the main road, her belongings searched by guards who seemed more interested in intimidation than investigation. She maintained her composure, answered their questions with the simple honesty of someone with nothing to hide, and was eventually allowed to proceed. The documents reached their next destination intact. The process continued for 6 months, each transfer carrying risk that could not be eliminated, each courier accepting the possibility that their participation could cost them everything. The documents moved from hand to hand, traveling through a network of relatives and friends and sympathetic strangers, passing through post offices and bus stations and private homes, steadily making their way toward the capital. Clara coordinated from within the Hollow, receiving coded messages that confirmed each successful transfer, adjusting plans when obstacles emerged, maintaining the operation's security through practices she had developed over nearly a decade of clandestine documentation. In the autumn of 1967, the documents finally reached Washington. Margaret Holloway received a package containing hundreds of pages of evidence, photographs, testimonies, and Clara's own documentation spanning 16 years of observations. Holloway was initially skeptical of what she received. The claims were too extreme, too systematic, too damning to accept without rigorous verification. She spent weeks examining the materials, cross-referencing them with other sources, consulting with medical experts and former government officials who could evaluate their authenticity. She reached out to her network of contacts within federal agencies, seeking confirmation or denial of the program's existence. The responses she received were telling in their evasiveness, not denials but deflections, not explanations but warnings. As her investigation deepened, Holloway became convinced that the documents were genuine and that the story they told was one of the most significant government scandals in American history. She began writing an article that would expose the Blackwood Hollow program to the world, working in secret, trusting no one outside a small circle of colleagues who understood the stakes involved. Margaret Holloway never published that story. 2 weeks before her deadline, federal agents arrived at her office with a warrant that authorized the seizure of all materials related to her investigation. Her research was confiscated. Her notes were taken. Her copies of the documents from Blackwood Hollow were removed and never returned. She was informed in terms that were legally precise and personally threatening that the materials she possessed were classified under national security provisions, that any attempt to publish would result in prosecution, that her career and her freedom depended on her cooperation and her silence. She was offered a choice that was no choice at all. Comply and survive, or resist and be destroyed. Margaret Holloway complied. Her career in investigative journalism effectively ended that day, her reputation undermined by rumors that were carefully planted, her access to sources systematically eliminated. She spent the remaining decades of her life in relative obscurity, teaching journalism at a small college, haunted by the story she could not tell. The documents from Blackwood Hollow disappeared into government archives, sealed under classification orders, that would remain in place for decades, hidden in bureaucratic systems designed to ensure that certain truths would never see daylight. The people of the Hollow never learned how close they had come to exposure. They only knew that the winter of 1967 passed like all the winters before it, without change, without hope, without rescue from the forces that held them captive. The program officially concluded in 1971, though the reasons for its termination were never disclosed to those who had survived it. The federal personnel withdrew over a period of months, dismantling the fenced facility, removing equipment, destroying records that had been maintained locally. The residents watched these departures with feelings they could not name. Relief and suspicion mingled with a grief that had no outlet. Dr. Crane delivered a final address to the community, thanking them for their cooperation, assuring them that their participation had contributed to important advancements in medical science, promising that they would not be forgotten. Then he left, and the Hollow fell silent for the first time in 20 years. The surviving residents were offered modest compensation in exchange for signing agreements that prohibited them from discussing their experiences with anyone outside the community. The amounts were insultingly small, given what had been taken from them, but most signed anyway. They had no choice. They had no strength left to resist. They had no hope that resistance would achieve anything but additional suffering. Clara Boggs was among the last to sign, her name a mark of defeat after 2 decades of resistance. She died in 1984, her archive still hidden beneath her cabin's floorboards, her story still untold. The truth about Blackwood Hollow remained buried until 2003, when a routine declassification review at a federal records facility accidentally released a cache of documents that had been misfiled decades earlier. A graduate researcher at a university in Tennessee discovered them while investigating an unrelated topic and recognized their significance immediately. The papers described in clinical detail the program that had destroyed an American community. They named the researchers who had conducted the experiments. They identified the agencies that had authorized and funded the work. They documented the compounds that had been tested and the casualties that had resulted. They confirmed everything that Clara Boggs had recorded, everything that Thomas Mercer had died. Investigating everything that Margaret Holloway had been silenced for attempting to reveal. The story was finally told through academic papers and eventually through media coverage that brought brief national attention to a tragedy that had occurred half a century earlier. But by the time the truth emerged, most of the victims were gone. The Hollow itself was nearly abandoned, its remaining residents elderly and broken, their children scattered across the country in search of lives untainted by their origins, their grandchildren often unaware of the heritage they carried. The leaked documents revealed the full scope of the betrayal that had been inflicted on an American community by its own government. The residents of Blackwood Hollow had been exposed to radioactive compounds as part of a study designed to measure the effects of nuclear fallout on civilian populations. The research had been intended to inform civil defense planning during the Cold War, to help military and government officials understand how communities would respond to nuclear attack and how exposure effects would manifest over time. The people of the Hollow had been chosen because they were poor and isolated and invisible. They were the perfect subjects, expendable, voiceless, forgotten by a nation that had no interest in their welfare and no awareness of their existence. Their suffering had produced data that filled classified reports and informed policies that protected other Americans. But it had never brought them justice or recognition or healing. The aftermath of the disclosure was muted in ways that would have devastated Clara Boggs had she lived to witness it. A congressional inquiry was announced but never completed, its proceedings stalled by procedural objections and jurisdictional disputes until public interest faded and the matter was quietly dropped. Lawsuits were filed by surviving victims and their descendants, but were dismissed on grounds of sovereign immunity and statute of limitations, legal technicalities that protected the institutions responsible for the program's crimes. The surviving victims received no additional compensation beyond the pittances they had accepted decades earlier. They received no formal apology from the agencies that had authorized their destruction. They received no acknowledgement from the government that had classified them as expendable and then discarded them when their usefulness was exhausted. The story appeared in newspapers and magazines, generated brief outrage among those who encountered it, and then faded from public consciousness as other stories claimed attention and other outrages demanded response. Blackwood Hollow became a footnote in the documented history of Cold War experimentation, mentioned alongside other programs that had used unwitting Americans as test subjects, catalogued in academic papers that few people outside specialized fields would ever read. But for those who had lived through it, for those who had lost parents and children and neighbors and their own health, for those who had watched their community die slowly across 2 decades of systematic destruction, it was not a footnote. It was their entire world. It was everything they had known and loved and hoped for, destroyed by the country they had trusted, by the government they had served, by institutions that were supposed to protect them and had instead used them as resources to be consumed. Today, Blackwood Hollow exists only as a memory preserved in archives and academic papers. The cabins have collapsed into piles of rotting timber. The church, where Dr. Whitmore first addressed the community, is gone, its foundations barely visible beneath the undergrowth that has reclaimed the site. The roads have been abandoned to the forest, their roots traceable only by the unnatural straightness of the trees that have grown where packed earth once provided passage. The cemetery on the hillside remains, its stones weathered and tilted, some fallen completely, the names of the dead still legible on a few, but faded to illegibility on most. Clara Boggs is buried there, her grave marked by a simple stone that bears her name and dates and nothing more. Her archive was eventually discovered by researchers investigating the site, retrieved from beneath floorboards that had protected it for decades, donated to a historical museum that few people visit. It stands as testimony to the courage of a woman who refused to let the truth be erased, who documented what was being done to her community even when documentation seemed futile, who preserved evidence that would ultimately confirm the crimes that had been committed against her people. The site of the fenced facility has been remediated according to government records, the contaminated soil removed, the structures demolished, the land supposedly restored to something approaching its natural state. But those who know where to look can still find traces of what was. There, concrete foundations hidden beneath leaves and vines, metal fixtures rusted but recognizable, depressions in the earth where underground structures once existed. The water in the hollow still carries a metallic taste that testing cannot fully explain. The trees in certain areas still grow in patterns that suggest something wrong beneath the surface. The land remembers what was done to it and to the people who lived upon it, even if the nation that authorized that destruction has chosen to forget If you watched until here, it is because you could handle the truth. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until here," so I can know who truly follows these stories to their darkest conclusions. This history was buried for a reason. It was classified and hidden and sealed away because it reveals the darkest capacity of institutions that claim to serve the public good. It was suppressed because it exposes the vulnerability of those who exist outside the protection of power, who lack the voice and the influence to defend themselves against forces that view them as resources rather than human beings. And it was leaked, ultimately, because someone within the system believed that the truth matters more than convenience, more than institutional reputation, more than the comfortable lies that allow us to sleep at night, believing that our government would never deliberately harm its own citizens. The people of Blackwood Hollow deserved better than what they received. They deserved protection from the nation they had served, not exploitation by agencies that viewed them as expendable. They deserved medical care that was actually designed to heal them, not experimental protocols that used their bodies to generate data. They deserved to be remembered as human beings with names and families and dreams, not as subjects in classified studies, not as data points in reports that were sealed for decades, not as footnotes in academic papers that reduce their suffering to statistics. This video exists to give them that remembrance, incomplete and inadequate as it may be. It exists because Clara Boggs believed that someone, someday, would need to know what happened. It exists because Thomas Mercer died trying to tell this story. It exists because Margaret Holloway sacrificed her career rather than pretend the truth did not matter. Subscribe to this channel if you believe that forgotten stories deserve to be told, that communities erased from history deserve to be remembered, that crimes hidden behind classification deserve to be exposed. Like this video if you believe that history must not be sanitized or suppressed to protect the powerful, that the uncomfortable truths are precisely the ones that need to be heard. Share it with others who need to understand that progress has always had its victims, that the advancements we celebrate were sometimes built on the suffering of those who were never asked to sacrifice, and that those victims deserve to be seen and acknowledged and mourned. The mountains of Appalachia keep many secrets in their hollows and valleys and forgotten places. Blackwood Hollow was one of them, hidden for decades, revealed only through accident and persistence, and the stubborn refusal of truth to remain buried forever. Now this story belongs to you. Carry it forward into conversations and memories, and the understanding you bring to news of government programs and classified research and isolated communities that exist beyond the reach of public attention. Remember the people who lived and suffered and died there. Remember Clara Boggs, who documented their destruction when documentation seemed pointless. Remember Thomas Mercer, who died trying to expose the truth. Remember Margaret Holloway, who was silenced but never forgot. Remember the children who were buried on that hillside, the miners who died gasping for air, the families who watched their community destroyed by the country they loved. Remember Blackwood Hollow, because they deserve to be remembered, and because what happened there could happen again, is perhaps happening now in other isolated places to other forgotten people, hidden behind classifications and protected by the same institutional power that destroyed a community in the mountains of Kentucky. The only defense against such crimes is awareness. The only protection is remembrance. The only justice is the truth, told and retold until it can no longer be ignored. Remember.